Rarely seen in U.S. history, a suspected Chinese surveillance balloon made its way across the continental United States. As the Chinese balloon finally reached the Atlantic Ocean, the U.S. Air Force sent an F-22 fighter jet to shoot it down. China responded by condemning the downing and threatening to retaliate. As tension between the two nations rise, we take a look at what got us here. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I am Catherine Lu.
I'm Rath Wang. Coming up on our show today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken postponed his trip to Beijing in what was widely seen as a de-escalation of tensions between intense U.S.-China competition. We look at how the U.S. could react to this rare violation of U.S. sovereignty right in the middle of its heartland and the far-reaching impact this could have on Taiwan. Then we hear from top military expert Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., on what are China's motives behind sending its suspected spy balloon into continental U.S. airspace.
They probably wanted some kind of operation to test the United States defenses and, finally, for political signaling, to signal to the United States that if you encroach on our sphere of influence, we'll encroach on your homeland, we'll encroach on your allies and partners.
We will then discuss whether Balloon Gate is an extension of the ongoing infighting in the Chinese Communist Party and how strong opposition against Xi Jinping is as China battles a struggling economy, record unemployment amid U.S. sanctions and bans. We also hear from cross-strait expert Bonnie Glaser, director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, on how China is using unprecedented measures to change the status quo by force.
China's the only actor here that has used military means to change the status quo. And that's a totally different category and shouldn't be countenanced by the international community.
Lastly, we discuss Xi Jinping's ambitions in taking Taiwan by force, as the PLA has upped the ante in its military intimidation against Taiwan, triggering U.S. allies around the region to redraw their defense strategies and including a Taiwan contingency.
Welcome to the show. Joining us in the studio today to discuss this is Tso Chen-dong, Professor of Political Science at National Taiwan University, former Kuomintang Mainland Affairs Department Director. Chen-dong is also an expert in Taiwan-U.S.-China relations. And Lev Nachman, Assistant Professor in the College of Social Science at National Chengchi University. Lev has a PhD in Political Science at the University of California at Irvine and is an expert in the region's geopolitics. A warm welcome back to both professors.
I spoke earlier to Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute based in Washington, D.C. Cronin is also an expert in Asian military affairs and a frequent commentator on CNN and is in South Korea's Donga Ilbo and the Singaporean Strait Times. And I also spoke earlier to Bonnie Glaser, Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Bonnie is a China expert based in Washington, D.C. She is also a frequent commentator on cross-strait relations and Taiwan policy in U.S. and international media. Let's now talk about the suspected Chinese spy balloon and what this means for the future of U.S.-China relations and how it could in turn affect Taiwan. My first question goes to you, Lev. Coming from the U.S., how is the U.S. public responding to this spy balloon?
I think this has really brought U.S.-China relations into the spotlight for a lot of American citizens who might not otherwise really have spent much time thinking about the degrading relationship between the U.S. and China. Because the balloon really took headlines by storm all across the U.S., I really think this put U.S.-China relations front and center for the United States' domestic audience.
And my second question goes to Professor Tso. China's defense ministry threatened to retaliate by telling the U.S. it reserves the right to deal with similar situations, and the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his trip to Beijing. Do you feel that China-U.S. relations will deteriorate, and what kind of retaliation do you expect both sides to have?
First of all, I think the Chinese Ministry of Defense does not use the word retaliation, but it just said that it will reserve the rights to do the same to similar situation. I think we have to consider the situation in which the two great powers are colluding toward each other. So what's the motivation behind any possible retaliation? I would say that China would want the debris of the balloon to be returned back to China. And that's the key issue on the table. So any retaliation would be launched for that purpose. And what kind of retaliation that China might be used in order to achieve that goal? I think one possibility some would suspect is that China may keep some detainees of U.S. citizens in China as a leverage to ask U.S. to consider. Yeah. But other possibilities that people have talked about includes economic sanction or other forceful means on the economic front. But basically, I think the two sides are still communicating with each other. And what strikes me a lot is on the very day when the United States took the action to shoot down the balloon, U.S. Minister of Defense, U.S. Secretary of Defense tried to make a phone call to his counterpart in China, but the Chinese Minister of Defense refused to take that call. So if that is the case, then I think there would probably no need for further retaliation because it is just a gesture of dissatisfaction. And once the two sides can get connected through phone or other more efficient ways, then they might start to converse on what kind of compromise they could achieve. Then that could avoid further retaliation.
Speaking of calls from China, we've also heard the Chinese side ask for compensation. Lev, do you feel that's a possibility? Will the U.S. pay China?
I think we're all really eager to see where the direction goes from here. Whether or not there's going to be some sort of monetary response, I don't know. But really what I have my eye on is the fact that Blinken's trip was not canceled, but rather it was postponed. And this is kind of an important silver lining because this tells us that there is still the hope that there can be a floor to stand on, even though this is a major hiccup for what many were hoping was going to be a first step at the return to normalization.
Lev, I want to ask you about nearly 80 years ago, we've seen Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was described as waking up the tiger giant. Do you see similarities between these two events? Is America sleeping?
So it's definitely too soon to tell, but this is going to be a very important question for public opinion in the United States, especially as the next presidential election in 2024 starts to ramp up. Even though the United States just had a midterm, what we did see was more rhetoric on China than we've seen in quite some time. Now, whether or not this is going to continue, I think many political analysts in the United States see China as becoming an increasingly salient topic for the U.S. domestic audience. And in fact, we see way more politicians starting to voice on not just China, but also Taiwan in a way that we've never really seen before. So this balloon story, I think, has really been somewhat of a gift for those that have been investing in China rhetoric in the United States as a way to say, see, I was right this whole time. China really is an important topic that we should be talking about. So I'm guessing that this is going to increase the amount of discussion and discourse on U.S.-China relations as we go into the next major election in the United States. Now, whether or not this is going to create an immediate kind of scare response, I think it's yet to be seen, but something that's important to keep in mind is that this is not World War II, and that the historical metaphor of looking at Pearl Harbor, which was a dire, sad incident with lots of death, and a balloon flying over the United States are not the same.
Okay, I'm very curious about the public sentiment after the event.
So, really the reason I think public sentiment was able to be driven so much was because President Biden took a long time to shoot the balloon down. Now, that's not meant to mean that it was a bad decision, right? That's there is calculation behind why they decided to wait so long. Whether or not it was to see where the balloon was going to go, whether or not it was to gather as much information about the balloon as they could before they shot it down. But for better or for worse, by having the balloon stay up for so long and allowing headlines to just focus on the balloon for such a long time,
seeing clear pictures.
It was so easy. And the fact that, when they shot the balloon down, it was done in such a public space. Like, people knew where to go. They were pulling out their phones to record the whole thing. It was a public spectacle for the United States.
So it's not fast enough, it's not professional enough.
Oh no, I do not mean it was not fast enough or not professional enough. I mean it was used as a way to really bring this into the spotlight. Like, it was used in a way to make sure that everyone who was following this story could really see it from beginning, climax to end. And this was really kind of a brilliant tactic for those who want to make China front and center in the United States, because essentially China created this gift for those who are trying to make China rhetoric front and center in the United States by creating this spectacle of a balloon. A spy balloon for the American public is such a strange thing to have to think about in the year 2023. We don't think about spy balloons anymore. So not only is there one from China over the United States, but we get to watch it get shot down with our phones. Like, this became such a phenomenon in the United States in and of itself.
Especially during the social media era.
Especially during the social media era. So it's not that Biden acted poorly or irresponsibly. I wouldn't attach those kind of judgment words to his actions. I think more it's, regardless of the motive or the intention, it became a spectacle. And I think those that have been trying to make China front and center will be very happy that it was such a spectacle.
Making China front and center, Professor Zhou, I want to go back to you in terms of how this will impact U.S. politics. Do you feel that this will be a determining factor in next year's presidential elections?
Well, definitely, because this is such a dramatic event, and everybody can remember some part of the details, which would have impact on how the conversation flowing over the social media. So definitely, I think it will have impact on next year's presidential election. But I also think that how the things will end will also have a significant impact.
You mean if both sides can come to some kind of consensus and lower down the tension?
That's right. Then that could be considered as a successful case of U.S.-China diplomacy.
Speaking of, say, this is resolved peacefully or in a manner that could lower the tensions, there's a McCarthy visit that might be happening in Taiwan. Do you feel that would be the second incident of, say, U.S.-China tensions in 2023?
I think it's definitely a concern for all three sides, Taiwan, China, and the United States. Obviously, Speaker McCarthy has made it clear that he would like to visit Taiwan.
Not set date yet?
Say it?
No, not set date yet.
No, there is no set date yet, and it is not confirmed in any sort of outlet. But it's known that this is something that, especially after former Speaker Pelosi came, it's now known that he would like to come as well. Now, of course, the challenge is, as we saw with the case of Nancy Pelosi, Xi Jinping wanted Biden to tell Pelosi not to come. But as we know in the United States, that is not how separation of powers works. Biden can't pick up the phone and tell Nancy Pelosi what to do. President Biden can also not tell Speaker McCarthy what to do. So even though President Biden might be trying to find a common footing to get relations back to a place of normalcy with China, there is a good chance that a visit from McCarthy might further disrupt the hope that many have of trying to get back on a path of normalcy. The timing of the balloon was really awful in the sense that this really was a moment that many were hoping that we would be able to at least find the start of a common ground.
Yeah.
And then if we have a visit from McCarthy right in the near future as well, then I think that's going to make things even more difficult to return to that sense of normalcy.
I see.
Professor Zhou, how much do you think probability-wise McCarthy will visit Taiwan? Given that the balloon is out and Republicans want to look strong on China as opposed to the Biden administration.
First of all, Speaker McCarthy wants to come, and that's for sure. And secondly, I think the DPP administration wants him to come. So as long as these two factors stands, then I think the possibility of Speaker McCarthy to come is very high. But what really matters is when. When would that happen? Whether it will happen in the first half of this year or the second half of this year will have a significant impact. If he comes in the first half of this year, then I think the degree of tension might be lowered more or less. But if he comes by the end of the year, that will be on the eve of the presidential election of Taiwan, then I think the tension will be very high.
We just spoke about the suspected Chinese spy balloon and whether U.S.-China ties could further deteriorate. We also touch on what this means for Taiwan, as U.S. is the country's largest security partner and China its largest existential threat. Coming up next, we'll be hearing from Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank Hudson Institute, on China's motive in sending the suspected spy balloon into the continental U.S. airspace.
Let's now hear from longtime military expert Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the U.S.-based think tank Hudson Institute. Cronin is also a frequent commentator on CNN and in South Korea's Dong-A Ilbo and the Singaporean Strait Times. He spoke to me about why China sent the alleged spy balloon into U.S. airspace and how this is, in many ways, a wake-up call for America. Let's take a look.
China is getting more assertive in all of their military operations in air and sea, and they probably wanted some kind of operation to test the United States defenses and finally for political signaling, to signal to the United States that if you encroach on our sphere of influence, we'll encroach on your homeland, we'll encroach on your allies and partners. I think that's what the message is from the pattern of sea and air harassment of U.S. and allied aircraft. Thinking of Canadian patrol aircraft out of Kadena last spring. Think of the swarming of Taiwan. Think of the laser attack on Australia and the buzzing also of Australian planes.
How the Chinese surveillance balloon has had an impact on U.S.-China military capabilities.
I think the fact that we were unable to detect past balloon intrusions in the United States is eye-opening for the military, and there'll be a lot of hearings in Congress, a lot of discussions in the Pentagon and with allies and partners about how to now recognize that our adversaries, our potential adversaries, are not going to come from one single trajectory. We're learning more every day about the potential impact of the balloon incident on U.S. military preparations and U.S. work with allies and partners in the region of the Indo-Pacific. And by that, I mean the whole possibility that we have a surveillance gap in our own defenses of the homeland has now come to light with the commander of the North American Defense Command today talking about the fact that there is a gap in our ability to detect high altitude balloons. In this case, most of the balloons that have flown over U.S. territory in the past several years from China apparently were undetected, and only after the fact, sort of through going back through our own imagery, were we able to detect the fact that these balloons indeed did go over the U.S. territory. Hawaii, Guam, Florida, Texas, but there have been balloons over Taiwan. There have been balloon sightings over Japan, over the Philippines, and elsewhere. And I think now it's not that the United States needs to build an anti-balloon defense, but they clearly need to add in the sensor capabilities, because let's start, this balloon started by going over, say, ADAC and over Australia. We have expensive radars out in the Aleutian Islands. So if this is true, that it was not detected there, that would be a subject of considerable interest to both the Pentagon and to defense planners in Congress. I think another military lesson here is simply that even simple old technology like balloons that have been around hundreds of years for surveillance might have new missions in light of new digital technologies.
Has the U.S. adequately responded to shooting down the Chinese surveillance balloon?
The Biden administration has been so adamant that we really do need much more robust channels of communication for crisis avoidance, to avoid escalation, to de-escalate in a crisis. And of course, this is a casualty of the balloon incident, is that Secretary Blinken's visit to China is indefinitely postponed and will now have to try to be rescheduled at a time when hopefully China is being a little more conciliatory than they are at the moment, where they're going so far as demanding compensation for the shoot down of their spy balloon.
Do you feel this serves as a wake-up call for the U.S. in terms of not just the government, but the public in countering with this real threat from China?
it is a wake-up call not to be complacent, to take this very seriously. We already have this big question that the potential Taiwan scenario is posing for the U.S. For U.S. allies and for our collective defense industry as well, which is, are we trying to prepare for a possible big war and really try to deter war by preparing for it, not hoping to fight it, but having to be ready to do so? And secondly, or are we trying to help Taiwan, Ukraine, and other partners around the world who really are threatened by big powers with more asymmetric defenses? And so this is a question whether our defense industry, which is already stretched right now in a sort of peacetime plus or wartime minus environment, if we got into a much more kinetic environment, where would we make our priorities? And so trying to stockpile and prepare right now with ammunition, with missiles, with the sort of anti-access area denial capabilities that we've learned from the Chinese can be very helpful at defense and deterrence, but also still trying to plow ahead with the rather exquisite systems that we do want to build in terms of our aircraft and missiles in space, on the sea, and even on land.
Patrick, there seems to be new U.S. military activity or increased activity in the Pacific, as we've seen with the bases in the Philippines and talks with Japan and South Korea. In the context of Taiwan,
the United States has been true to its word in terms of China as the pacing threat, and Taiwan essentially as the pacing challenge of that threat. Because there is such a heightened concern that we must deter aggression over the Taiwan Strait. We must preserve peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We must make sure that we're not in the position of February 23 of last year, where the day before Russia went all out and invaded Ukraine. We want to avoid that kind of incident in a very different situation, to be sure, but nonetheless, a big power using all of its might and starting a war that many people thought was almost unthinkable, because there are other ways to pursue your interests. If you're a big power, you really don't need to shoot missiles into a modern city, and yet that's what Russia did. And so there's the idea that war is thinkable is unfortunately with us now. So deterring that in this decade and in the next couple of years in particular takes a lot of effort. So I think the U.S. is working assiduously. Japan taking its defense and defense transformation extremely seriously. Prime Minister Kishida's plan is something that the late Prime Minister Abe would have been extremely proud to see Japan take that step toward actually adding some offensive capability, not a lot, but enough to show that they're serious about deterrence and can help keep the peace. Korea getting very serious about playing a bigger regional role, putting out a new Indo-Pacific strategy for the first time. The fact that Philippines is offering up under President Bongbong Marcos 4 more enhanced defense cooperation access or EDCA agreement sites, especially ones that are located on the South China Sea and northern Luzon.
how is the U.S. leading its allies in the Pacific to counter an ever more aggressive China?
You can talk about AUKUS and what Australia, UK, US are about to announce in March with some significant steps on defense cooperation. Think even about India and the fact that there's this initiative on critical and emerging technologies with defense cooperation at the center of it. That shows a tremendous alignment between Delhi and Washington that was unthinkable. All of these can be attributed, frankly, to a souring assessment of China's intentions and a concern about China's possible use of aggression. And frankly, Rath, when that aggression is sort of pointed anywhere, it's always first pointed at Taiwan. And so I think trying to line up as much of the architecture of the region to support deterrence, to preserve peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, as the administration has sort of worked that formula, those words, into almost every bilateral agreement and multilateral agreement with ASEAN and others, shows that, yes, the Biden administration has been adamant of being able to deter aggression against Taiwan.
You just heard military expert Patrick Cronin speak to Rath about how the alleged Chinese spy balloon had served as a wake-up call for the U.S. and its allies in the Pacific, and how Taiwan is the region's top security priority. Now let's talk about what's going on in the opaque Chinese Communist regime. Professor, we know so little about what's really going on within this Communist Party. At the very least, there's been mixed signal. On the personal level, I'm also very curious, what do you think, who released the balloon, who made the call? Could it be the challenger of Xi Jinping to challenge its foreign policy and to weaken its one-man rule?
Okay, now there are two stories about that. One story goes like this. This is done by some segment of the POA, and it is just to expressing its dissenting voice about the current state of China-U.S. relations, and it does not see the positive side of the visit paid by Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, so U.S. Secretary of State. So it is just to give U.S. a difficult lesson to test U.S. Okay, so
a difficult lesson to
test the U.S. But let me put it clear. The first story says it is done by some segment of the POA, but the second story said it is coordinated by the Communist Party at the highest level. So
right before
that. So it is just to test whether U.S. can sustain this pressure, how U.S. would react. So it is just to make China look strong while U.S. looks weak. So these two stories, one is a segment by one is that it is done by one segment of POA. The other is a coordinated action.
Which one is more likely, in your opinion?
Now, I think the first story is I would say is more persuasive. Why? Because that happens before, and people know that. But I think the highest level, the CCP leadership at the highest level, probably will not direct this, but it does not prevent that from happening either. So that means that the CCP leadership hope that the Secretary of State Blinken can pay the visit to China, but it does not. It was not able to curtail the dissenting voice within the CCP, especially within some part of the POA.
Does that mean there's no consensus in this party?
No, I think you can say that there is a mainstream voice, there is dissenting voice. Even though the leadership would like to see stabilization of Sino-U.S. relations, but there are voices within the CCP and even within the wider public that the U.S. should consider before any progress in the bilateral relations can proceed. So I think POA's voice has some support within the wider Chinese public, and that's why the CCP leadership at the highest level does not prevent this from happening, or even they probably does not know that beforehand. So. But I want to go back to your question because you asked whether this reflected the weakness of Xi Jinping's leadership.
Yes.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
Yeah, I don't think so. You can say that this event reflects the fact that Xi Jinping has some hurdles in implementing his decision. But I don't think that means that his leadership is weak or that his leadership is seriously challenged, because there is no significant challenge to his way of diplomacy within China. What really challenges his rule is domestic disquiet, such as white paper movement, such as the fragile state of the economy. I think these two really challenge his.
So on international affairs level, there's no different voice against his will, but more pressure from the domestic affairs.
Or say dissenting voice on the foreign policy arena is not so fatal to his rule.
I see.
Speaking of challenges to Xi Jinping's rule, Professor Nachman, wanted to ask you, how much leverage do you believe the U.S. has over China in terms of the challenges, as Professor Tso mentioned, China's economy, as we see China experiencing the lowest growth in the Chinese economy since the Cultural Revolution. That's exacerbated by U.S. bans and also with the opening up of zero COVID.
So on paper, it looks like there's this big economic showdown happening, but in reality, trade import-exports between the US and China are actually about to break a new record in terms of how high they are. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but even though rhetorically we hear all these very harsh talks about these two countries, their economies are still very much trading at very, very high levels, to the point that it's not matching the level of rhetoric. So even though domestically there's economic slowdown, even though the United States is using a number of economic tools to try to coerce the PRC in certain areas, when you look at total import-exports, there's not a decline. In fact, it's the opposite. The trade is not only about to break records, but it's well recovered from where we were pre-COVID. It's a little bit deceiving, but these economies are very much in a symbiotic relationship. Like, they are very much tied together. Many people might argue that this is actually one of the main reasons why conflict will not happen, is because their economies are so closely tied together. Even though there might be an escalation in rhetoric, even though there might be a continued degrade in relations, at the end of the day, both countries are still very reliant on each other when it comes to economic growth.
But if the U.S. wanted to do something to coerce China into not doing certain actions, do you feel that it has that power to do so?
So the thing about the global economy is it's global. So China is so intertwined in so many economies around the world, like the United States is, like Taiwan is, that to take a unilateral action just as the United States, it could do some harm, but the ability to fully coerce China just with economic means is difficult.
Which will be harder as to what it's done to Russia in the invasion of Ukraine.
Correct.
Professor, let's talk about some more about economic growth. Right now, I think China is working, collaborating with other countries or other economies to minimize the pressure from the U.S., including there's reports saying Xi Jinping will be visiting Moscow this spring, right in the center, amid the ongoing Ukraine and Russian invasion. What do you think the purpose behind this visit?
At this moment, Chinese government has not made any official announcement of his visit. The announcement is made by Russian's Ministry of Foreign Affairs 8 days ago.
And there's no response from China.
China. Even though from that announcement, we can suspect that the possibility of his visit is very high. Yeah. But you are right that PRC is taking steps to get closer to Russia, and at this moment, the PRC's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Ma Chaoxu is visiting Russia, and they are having a cozy talk about about bilateral relations. This is the second step of Mr. Ma. His first step during this trip is to South Africa, talking about the BRICS cooperation. So if we take these two events together, then I think the picture is quite clear. China wants to use its cooperation with Russia to pit against the United States. That's for sure. It also wants to prevent the situation in which China is isolated by U.S. and U.S. allies, whether it comes to military, security, or economic affairs.
But China has so many different trading partners around the world. How can they neglect the world's content against Russia and still make such movement?
Okay, basically, there are quite a number of countries who do not condemn Russia and continue to do business with Russia, such as India. Think about that. India is a member of a Quad, which U.S. led as a key point of U.S. diplomacy. So when India continue to do business with Russia, Vietnam continue to do business with Russia, then why not China? China will have that thought in mind. But I also want to add one other point. China, the key point for China to revive its economy is not to expand its cooperation with other autocracies. Instead, China wants to expand its cooperation with other democracies on the economic front. So, especially Europe.
That's to counter the U.S.
Yeah, to counter U.S. pressure. So Germany, France, and other European countries.
I see.
Yeah.
But by doing so, would that actually jeopardize how it's trying to court U.S. allies with talks to Russia? Because it seems to be U.S. allies are all united against Russia.
Not really, because take the example of Germany. Germany wants to see the ending of Russia's invasion toward Ukraine. So that needs to be done through diplomacy, and China might be a positive force on that front. So.
Okay, we just discussed the potential turmoil in the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping's daunting task in saving China's economy as the U.S. pushed forward with its sanctions and bans. Coming up next, we'll be hearing from China expert Bonnie Glaser, director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S., on how China is unilaterally changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
Let's now hear from Bonnie Glaser, director of the Asia program at the U.S.-based German Marshall Fund. Bonnie is an expert in China and cross-strait relations based in Washington, D.C. She is also a frequent commentator on Taiwan in U.S. and international media. She spoke to me about China's attempt to unilaterally change the status quo through military means. Let's take a look.
We have to start, of course, by recognizing that the definitions of the status quo are not shared by these three actors. Taiwan's definition of the status quo is that it is an independent sovereign state. The United States doesn't take a position on Taiwan's sovereignty. It says that remains unsettled historically and could at some future date be settled. And of course, we know China's position is Taiwan is part of China. And so changing the status quo is dynamic to begin with. It's not static. And there's no doubt that in the aftermath of Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that the Chinese decided to militarily change the status quo. And they have been operating at a far higher level of military activity and operating over the center line in the Taiwan Strait on virtually a daily basis. And of course, doing this with their naval ships as well as military aircraft. Higher numbers, sustained at a high level, and operating closer to Taiwan. And so whether we want to admit this or not, or acknowledge it or recognize it, it does appear that the PRC has in some ways changed the status quo in its favor. And that is very, very worrisome. I think that the United States has certainly taken steps in reaction to China to try and strengthen Taiwan's security, to reassure Taiwan, to warn the PRC. And from China's perspective, yes, they interpret that as changes in the status quo. So it depends on where you sit. Of course, from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan changed the status quo when it decided not to accept the 1992 consensus after Tsai Ing-wen was elected. So this is a complicated picture because all three sides have their own perspectives. That said, China's the only actor here that has used military means to change the status quo. And that's a totally different category and shouldn't be countenanced by the international community.
Do you feel that in extreme scenarios such as an economic downturn would serve as an excuse or a scapegoat, and a convenient scapegoat for the Chinese, especially with Xi Jinping showing his leadership position, to use Taiwan as something to distract the Chinese public?
I personally think that when China experiences domestic problems and crises, that it tends to turn inward rather than outward. There are a few exceptions in Chinese history, but for the most part, they do not become bellicose in using force against countries. So I would expect that Xi Jinping might be more assertive and certainly against Taiwan, use more pressure, economic pressure, military pressure, diplomatic pressure, more disinformation, cyber attacks, all of the things that we refer to as gray zone threats, staying under the threshold that would trigger use of force by the United States to defend Taiwan, but nevertheless putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan. And in my view, the PLA is not ready for a military confrontation with the United States and does not have full confidence that it can seize and control Taiwan.
We just discussed Balloon Gate as the U.S.-China spat continues. Let us know in the YouTube comment section if you think Xi Jinping's spy plans will trigger a strong U.S. allied response against China. Has the Red Dragon tantalized Uncle Sam? Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to the Taiwan Talks YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
You just heard Bonnie Glaser speak to Rath about how China is trying to change the status quo through military intimidation of Taiwan and driving the U.S. and its allies away. CIA Director William Burns has warned that while Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine may have made Chinese President Xi Jinping more cautious about taking Taiwan by force, but his ambition should not be underestimated. He also mentioned that the U.S. intelligence agency have heard Xi Jinping order the PLA to prepare for a potential Taiwan invasion by 2027.
We know as a matter of intelligence that he's instructed the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027 to conduct a successful invasion. Now, that does not mean that he's decided to conduct an invasion in 2027 or any other year, but it's a reminder of the seriousness of his focus and his ambition.
Lev, this timeline, 2027, is so sensitive. How credible is this statement?
So I think it's really important to distinguish that capabilities and intent are two very different things. So what we hear is that Xi would like the PLA to be capable by 2027, but like the former CIA director just said, that is not the same as he intends to attack in 2027. And it's that piece of information that's important to keep in mind, especially when there's a lot of fear around this date of 2027. I think this is kind of become this imagined point of no return for many people, but there's nothing about 2027 that says that there's a guaranteed timeline for an actual invasion to occur.
But isn't it once he's ready to go?
Not necessarily. There's no inevitability behind Xi's decision to invade Taiwan. Only under very specific circumstances would Xi feel the need to actually take such a drastic action to invade Taiwan. Now, of course, we have some different hypotheses about what those conditions look like, but there's nothing inevitable about just, as soon as January 1st, 2027 arrives, that means he's got to go. There's nothing like that that states that to be an inevitable truth.
What conditions do you feel are likely for Xi to invade?
So there's a number of different ways we can look at this question. So the first, of course, is domestic. So we talk a lot about Xi and the CCP's authority and legitimacy. So if Xi Jinping feels that his authority is under threat to the point where there's no other action that can be done, Taiwan essentially serves as a trump card for him. Same with the legitimacy of the party. If the party feels that its legitimacy domestically is under threat, then Taiwan serves as a valuable tool for the party to use in order to kind of regain this kind of nationalistic sentiment domestically. Now, of course, there's also international conditions, things that we talk about, red lines that might be crossed that push Xi into a certain corner. So something like if the world formally recognizes Taiwan, or Taiwan formally declares independence with the backing of the rest of the world, then these sorts of actions would perhaps make Xi feel like he has no other choice but to take such a drastic action. But it's important to remember, war is bad, and no one wants war, and Xi is far too rational of an actor to pursue war just for the sake of pursuing war, which many people who talk about this 2027 hypothesis seem to assume that Xi wants war when I don't think that's true.
But from a point of view of his legacy, don't you think he does have a timeline, at least within his leadership in this party?
There's nothing guaranteed about his desire to take Taiwan. Now, he said things like we should not pass this on to the next generation, and that one day this is inevitably going to happen. But every leader of the PRC has said that. And that even though Xi wants to have this big legacy, he's already written his name into the party constitution. He's already done such drastic things that it's not a matter of he needs to do something to create a name for himself. He has already created a name for himself. And that this rhetoric of he wants to do it for the sake of him being the one to do it, I don't think is convincing, again, for the point of going to war just for that sake.
Professor Joy, there are lots of comparisons that are drawn between Taiwan and Ukraine as being on the front lines of defending democracy against autocracy. Do you feel the experience in Ukraine, the ongoing conflict there, has deterred Xi in any way to consider a military move? As Lev mentioned, that's probably not his top priority right now, and the risk of invasion is low.
Let me just say this. I concur with Levin that Xi and China do not feel any necessity of fighting a war against the U.S. Instead, China wants to avoid a war with the United States. So then the next question would be what kind of lesson they take from the Ukraine war. And I think one lesson is that economic sanction does harm Russia. So if in the future there's a war between China and Taiwan, then the first thing China needs to do is to prevent itself from being harmed so severely by Western economic sanction like Russia suffered during the war.
That's why we see their version of the SWIFT system that they're propping up.
That's right. That's why they asked Saudi Arabia to accept renminbi.
Thanks for watching the show today, and stay safe. We'll see you next time.